If you kneel now, you might survive, someone whispered behind her, but Elena Whitmore didn't turn, didn't flinch, didn't even breathe differently as she stood alone at the center of the great obsidian hall, the cold stone beneath her thin shoes leaching warmth from her body inch by inch, the air thick with the scent of polished marble, burning wax, and something sharper, power, raw and suffocating, pressing against her chest like an invisible weight that made every heartbeat feel louder than it should have been, like the entire court could hear it echoing inside her ribs. And maybe they could, because hundreds of eyes were already on her, watching, judging, waiting for her to break, for her shoulders to curl inward, for her gaze to drop to the floor the way an Omegas always did when surrounded by alphas. But Elena didn't lower her eyes, not even when the towering pillars seemed to close in around her, not even when the murmurs began to ripple through the crowd like a quiet storm, not even when she felt the first flicker of fear tighten her throat, because fear was something she had learned to live with, to carry like a second skin, ever since the day her pack decided she was less than nothing, ever since the day they called her soulless, broken, incomplete, a girl without a wolf in a world where that meant everything. And now here she stood, summoned not as a person but as an offering, a bargaining piece dressed in pale fabric that clung too loosely to her frame. A reminder to everyone watching that she did not belong in a place like this, not in a court carved from black stone and gold, not among nobles draped in silks and confidence, not beneath the high vaulted ceiling where banners bearing the Alpha King's crest hung like silent witnesses to power she could never claim. And yet she was here, because her family had no other choice, because survival had been reduced to a single desperate agreement, because somewhere beyond these walls, people she loved were counting on her to do what Omegas had always done: submit, obey, disappear. But Elena could feel something inside her resisting, something quiet but unyielding, like a thread pulled tight deep within her chest, and it only grew stronger as the heavy doors at the far end of the hall creaked open, with a sound that cut through every whisper, every breath, every heartbeat. And suddenly the room shifted, the energy changing so abruptly it felt like stepping into a different world, because he had entered, and even before she saw him, Elena felt it, that crushing, undeniable presence that belonged to only one man in the entire kingdom, a presence that didn't just fill the room but claimed it, bending every gaze, every thought, every ounce of attention toward him as if pulled by gravity itself. And when she finally looked, she understood why. Because Alpha King Lucian Blackthorn did not walk like other men. He moved with a stillness that felt deliberate, controlled, like a force held carefully in check, his dark coat falling perfectly along his frame, his silver eyes catching the flicker of torchlight in a way that made them seem almost unreal, too sharp, too aware, as if nothing in this room could escape his notice. And as he stepped forward, the sound of his boots against stone echoed in a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to silence even the air itself, and one by one, the nobles bowed their heads, their movements instinctive, automatic, a silent acknowledgement of the authority he carried. But Elena did not bow. She could feel the expectation pressing down on her from all sides, feel the weight of it like hands on her shoulders trying to force her down. But her feet stayed planted, her spine stayed straight, even as her pulse began to race, even as her palms grew damp with the effort of holding herself steady. And she knew they were watching her now, really watching, not with casual curiosity, but with something sharper, something almost dangerous, because an Omega who did not kneel was not just unusual. She was a disruption, a crack in a system that had never been questioned, and that made her visible in a way she had never been before, painfully, impossibly visible. And for a moment she wondered if she had made a mistake, if defiance was just another form of foolishness that would cost more than she could afford. But then she remembered her mother's voice, soft but firm, echoing from years ago, telling her never to bow to someone who saw her as less. And the memory steadied her, anchored her, gave her something solid to hold on to, as Lucian Blackthorn came to a stop just a few feet away, close enough that she could feel the subtle warmth of his presence cutting through the chill of the hall, close enough that the faint scent of pine and winter air seemed to linger around him, sharp and clean and utterly unlike anything else in the room. And when he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, carrying effortlessly through the silence as if it belonged there. As if the hall itself existed only to echo his words. "Elena Whitmore," he said, and hearing her name in his voice felt strange, like it didn't quite belong to her anymore, like it had been reshaped by the weight of who he was. "You stand before this court as a proposed bride." The words settled over her like a verdict, final and unyielding, and somewhere behind her, someone shifted, a quiet movement that carried more meaning than any shout, because everyone knew what came next. Everyone knew the role she was meant to play, the answer she was supposed to give, the path she was expected to follow, and for a heartbeat, Elena felt it all pressing in on her at once. The fear, the expectations, the consequences waiting just beyond a single choice. But then something inside her went still, completely still, like the center of a storm where everything quiets before the next surge. And in that stillness, she realized something that felt both terrifying and freeing at the same time. That she had nothing left to lose except herself, and she had already spent years losing pieces of that, piece by piece, until there was barely anything left that felt truly hers. And maybe that was why her voice, when it came, didn't shake the way she expected it to, didn't falter or break under the weight of the moment. It simply existed, clear and steady and impossible to ignore as it cut through the silence, just as sharply as his had moments before. "I will never be your bride," she said, and the words seemed to hang in the air, suspended between them, too bold, too final, too real to take back. And for a fraction of a second, nothing happened, no one moved, no one spoke. The entire court frozen as if time itself had hesitated, and Elena could feel every heartbeat in her chest, could feel the way the world seemed to narrow down to this single moment, this single decision, this single defiance that could change everything. And she didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if she had just sealed her fate or shattered it. But she did know one thing with absolute certainty as she met the Alpha King's gaze without looking away. For the first time in her life, she had chosen herself, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was waiting. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured slowly, like thin ice under pressure. A faint intake of breath here, the soft rustle of fabric there, the barely contained disbelief rippling through the court as if the walls themselves had heard something they were not meant to. And Elena felt it before she saw it. The shift in attention, the sharpness of it, the way every gaze that had once dismissed her now locked onto her with a kind of stunned focus. Because what she had done was not just unexpected, it was unthinkable, an Omega refusing the Alpha King in his own court. And yet she stood there, unmoving, her pulse loud in her ears but her posture unchanged, as if the weight of what she had just said had not yet settled into her bones. And for a moment, she wondered if perhaps it never would, if perhaps this was what freedom felt like, not light or easy, but steady, grounded, unyielding. And then the temperature of the room seemed to drop, not physically, but something deeper, something instinctive, the way the air shifts before a storm. And she knew without looking that his attention had sharpened, that the stillness around Lucian Blackthorne had changed in a way that was almost imperceptible but impossible to ignore, because power did not need to be loud to be felt. And when he finally moved, it was not sudden, not aggressive, just a slight tilt of his head, a subtle narrowing of his silver eyes, as if he were studying something he did not quite understand. And that was when the murmurs truly began, low and urgent, voices weaving together in confusion and disbelief. "Did she just refuse him?" Someone whispered. "That is not possible." Another voice answered, sharper, more anxious. "She must not understand what she has done." And somewhere to her left, Elena caught the familiar tone of quiet disdain, the kind she had heard her entire life. "Of course she does not. She is an Omega without a wolf. What else could she be but foolish?" And the word struck something inside her, not enough to break her, but enough to remind her exactly where she stood, exactly how little this court thought of her, and yet none of them moved, none of them stepped forward to correct her, to force her to her knees. Because the decision did not belong to them, it belonged to him, and everyone was waiting, watching, holding their breath for the Alpha King to respond. And Elena realized that this moment, this fragile, suspended instant, was more dangerous than anything that had come before, because uncertainty was a space where anything could happen, and she did not know what Lucien Blackthorne would choose to do with it. And then he took a step closer, the sound of his boot against stone quiet, but unmistakable. And Elena felt it like a shift in gravity, her body instinctively aware of his proximity, even as she forced herself not to retreat, not to give even an inch of ground. And when he spoke again, his voice was still calm, still controlled, but there was something else beneath it now, something quieter, sharper, like the edge of a question that had not yet been asked. "You understand the consequences of what you are saying," he said, and it was not a threat, not exactly, but it carried the weight of one. The implication of everything that could follow, everything that could be taken away. And Elena's throat tightened for just a fraction of a second before she answered, because fear was still there. It had not vanished. It had simply been pushed aside, held back by something stronger. "I understand," she said, and her voice did not waver, even as her fingers curled slightly at her sides, even as she felt the faint tremor she refused to let anyone see. And that was when the tension shifted again, more sharply this time, because now it was not just disbelief in the air, it was anticipation, a rising, electric awareness that something was about to happen, something that would define everything that came after. And Elena felt it building, felt it in the way the court seemed to lean inward without moving, felt it in the way her own heartbeat seemed to sync with the silence. And then, without warning, something else entered the space between them, something she could not see but could feel, a subtle pressure that brushed against her senses like a whisper, like a question without words. And for a second she did not understand it, did not recognize it for what it was, because she had never felt anything like it before, never experienced the pull that every Omega was supposed to know, the connection that defined their place in the world. And yet this was different, not a pull but an absence, a hollow space where something should have been, and she saw it reflected in the court before she fully grasped it herself. The confusion, the flicker of unease, the way a few of the higher-ranking alphas shifted slightly, as if something expected had failed to happen. "Where is it?" someone murmured, too low for most to hear, but not low enough to escape the growing tension. "There should be a bond," another voice added. Uncertain now, there is always a bond. And Elena's breath caught as realization began to settle in, slow and heavy, because this was the moment they had all been waiting for. The invisible thread that was supposed to snap into place, the proof that she belonged here, that this was her destiny. And it was not there. It simply was not there, and the absence of it felt louder than anything else in the room, louder than her refusal, louder than the murmurs, louder even than the presence of the Alpha King himself. And for a heartbeat, doubt flickered through her, sharp and sudden, because if there was no bond, then what was she? What did that make her in a world where everything was defined by that connection? And she felt the old fear creeping back, the familiar whisper that she was less, that she was broken, that she did not fit anywhere. And then she saw his expression change, not dramatically, not in a way most would notice, but she saw it, the slightest shift in Lucien's gaze. The way his focus sharpened not with anger, but with something closer to curiosity, something that made her chest tighten for reasons she could not quite explain. And for the first time since she had spoken, Elena realized that this moment was no longer entirely under her control, that something larger was unfolding, something neither of them had expected. And the court felt it too, the unease spreading, the certainty they had always relied on beginning to crack. And then it happened, not as a surge or an explosion, but as a quiet, undeniable change within her, a warmth that began low in her chest, faint at first, almost easy to ignore, but growing, steady and deliberate, like a light being kindled in a place that had always been dark. And Elena froze, her breath catching as the sensation spread, not painful, not overwhelming, just present in a way that demanded attention, and she did not understand it, did not know what it meant, only that it was real. And as the warmth deepened, she saw the reaction ripple outward, saw the way the nearest nobles stiffened, the way a few stepped back without realizing it, as if instinct were guiding them away from something they could not name. And across from her, Lucien Blackthorne did not move, but his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made everything else fade. And for the first time since she had entered the hall, Elena felt something shift between them, not a bond, not the connection the court had expected, but something else entirely, something unknown. And in that moment, with the silence tightening around them once more, she understood that whatever came next would not follow the rules anyone here believed in. The warmth did not fade. It deepened, spreading through Elena's chest in slow, steady waves, as if something long dormant had finally decided to wake. And she stood there, caught between instinct and disbelief, her fingers tightening slightly at her sides as the sensation grew stronger, brighter, impossible to ignore, and the air around her seemed to shift in response, not violently, not sharply, but with a quiet awareness that rippled outward like a change in pressure before a storm. And she saw it reflected in the court, in the subtle steps backward, in the way conversations died before they could fully form, in the way even the most composed nobles now looked uncertain, their confidence cracking beneath something they could not explain, because this was not how the world worked, not how it had ever worked. And Elena felt that truth pressing against her thoughts as much as it pressed against theirs, because she knew the rules as well as anyone, knew what she was supposed to be, what she was supposed to feel, and this was not it. This was something else entirely, something that did not fit into the narrow space she had been given her entire life. And that realization was as terrifying as it was grounding, because if she did not fit, then maybe she had never been meant to. And the idea settled in her chest alongside the warmth, heavy and undeniable, and across from her. Lucian Blackthorne did not look away, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that stripped away everything else, the crowd, the hall, the expectations, until it felt like there was only the space between them and whatever invisible force now filled it. And for the first time, Elena saw something in his expression that she had not expected, not anger, not dominance, but something quieter, sharper, a kind of recognition that did not yet have a name, and it unsettled her more than any display of power could have, because she did not understand it, did not understand why the most powerful man in the kingdom would look at her like she was a question he needed answered. And the silence stretched, thick and fragile, until it was broken not by him, but by a voice from the edge of the court, older, strained with disbelief. "This is not possible." The words cut through the tension, drawing attention back to the wider room, back to the rules that had just been challenged, and Elena felt the shift immediately. The way the court tried to reassert itself, to contain what it did not understand. "There is no bond," another voice added, louder now, more certain, as if naming the absence could somehow restore order. "An Omega cannot stand before the Alpha King without forming a connection." And the murmurs rose again, sharper this time, more urgent, as if the crowd were trying to convince itself that this moment could still be explained, still be controlled. But Elena could feel it, the truth beneath their words, the fracture in their certainty, and it gave her something she had never had before, not confidence exactly, but a kind of clarity, a sense that whatever was happening was real, even if it did not make sense, and she held on to that as. The warmth inside her flared slightly, not enough to overwhelm, but enough to draw a quiet breath from her lips, enough to make the nearest nobles shift again, their instincts reacting before their minds could catch up. And then Lucian moved, not stepping forward this time, but lifting his hand slightly, a small, controlled gesture that carried more authority than any command, and the court fell silent instantly, the murmurs cutting off as if they had never existed, and Elena felt the weight of that silence settle over them once more, heavier now, more focused, because this was no longer just a disruption, it was a question that demanded an answer. And when he spoke, his voice was still calm, still measured, but there was something different in it now, something that made her breath catch before she could stop it. "Step closer," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried a weight that pressed against her instincts, against everything she had been taught to do and not do. And for a fraction of a second, Elena hesitated, not because she was afraid, but because she could feel the importance of the moment, the way this single action might shape everything that followed. And then she moved, one step forward, the sound of her shoe against stone quiet but unmistakable in the stillness, and the distance between them closed just enough that she could see the finer details of his expression, the sharp line of his jaw, the faint tension in his brow, the way his eyes seemed to search hers for something he had not yet found. And she forced herself to hold his gaze, even as her pulse quickened, even as the warmth in her chest responded to the proximity, growing slightly stronger, more aware, as if it recognized something she did not, and the sensation made her inhale sharply, a small, involuntary reaction she could not suppress, and she saw the flicker of it in his eyes. The way his focus sharpened further, the way his attention seemed to narrow entirely onto her, and, for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath again, waiting, watching, as if something unseen were about to reveal itself. And Elena felt it building, not in the room, but within her, the warmth shifting into something more defined, more deliberate, like a pulse that was not quite her own, and she did not understand it, did not know what it meant, but she knew it was leading somewhere, and that realization steadied her even as uncertainty pressed in from all sides. And then, without warning, Lucien spoke again, quieter this time, but no less powerful. "You feel it," he said, not a question, not quite a statement, but something in between, and Elena's breath caught, because she did, she felt something, something that did not belong to the world she knew, something that did not follow its rules, and she did not know how to answer, did not know if there was an answer that would make sense, and for a moment, she considered denying it, retreating back into the safety of what was expected, but the thought passed as quickly as it came, because she had already stepped beyond that, already chosen a path that did not allow for retreat, and so she did the only thing she could. She told the truth, even if she did not fully understand it herself. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but steady, and the words seemed to settle between them, carrying more weight than it should have, because it was not just an answer, it was an acknowledgement of something new, something unknown, and for a heartbeat, nothing else happened. No sudden change, no dramatic shift, just the quiet presence of that shared understanding. And then Elena saw it, the smallest change in Lucien's expression, the faintest softening at the edge of his gaze. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to feel. And it sent a strange, unexpected ripple through her chest, something that felt almost like recognition, though she could not say of what. And the realization unsettled her in a way she could not explain, because this was not how this moment was supposed to go, not how any of this was supposed to unfold. And yet here they were, standing in the center of a court that had lost its certainty, facing something neither of them had anticipated, and Elena understood, with a clarity that cut through her lingering doubt, that whatever had begun here would not end with this moment, that this was only the first fracture in a world that had never been questioned. And as the silence stretched once more, heavier now with meaning, she knew that nothing would ever return to what it had been before. The silence did not ease. It tightened, drawing every breath, every thought into a single fragile thread that stretched between Elena and the Alpha King, and she could feel it, the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing into her back, the expectation that something would happen to restore order, to correct what had gone wrong. But nothing moved, nothing broke, because whatever rules had governed this room no longer seemed to apply, and Elena stood there, aware of every detail in a way she had never been before. The faint flicker of torchlight along the obsidian walls, the distant echo of wind against the high windows nearly 30 feet above, the subtle shift of fabric as nobles adjusted without realizing it, all of it sharp, heightened, as if the world itself had narrowed to this moment and refused to let it pass unnoticed. And at the center of it all was the warmth in her chest, no longer just a flicker, but something steady, something deliberate, like a quiet flame that refused to be extinguished. And she realized with a sudden clarity that it was not reacting to fear, not reacting to the court, but to him, to the presence standing only a few feet away. And the thought unsettled her more than anything else had, because it implied connection, and yet it was nothing like the bond she had been taught to expect. It did not pull her toward him, did not demand submission or closeness. It simply existed, independent, unwavering, as if it belonged to her alone. And that difference mattered, even if she could not yet explain why. And across from her, Lucien Blackthorne seemed to understand that something was different as well, because he did not speak immediately, did not issue a command or correction. He simply watched, his silver eyes steady and intent, as if he were tracing the edges of something unseen. And the longer the silence stretched, the more the tension in the room shifted from expectation to unease, because this was not how power was supposed to behave, not how a king was supposed to respond. and Elena could feel that unease building, gathering strength as the court struggled to reconcile what they were witnessing with what they believed to be true. And then it came, a voice breaking through the quiet with forced authority, sharp and controlled. "Your Majesty." The words cut through the moment like a blade through still air, drawing attention away from the center, toward a figure stepping forward from the line of nobles, tall, composed, his expression carefully neutral despite the tension in his posture. "This situation requires resolution," he continued, his tone respectful but edged with urgency. "The court cannot remain in uncertainty." And Elena felt the shift immediately, the way the man's words attempted to reassert control, to pull the moment back into something structured, something familiar, and she recognized it for what it was, not just concern, but fear, the kind that came when something fundamental began to slip beyond understanding, and for a heartbeat, she wondered if Lucien would accept that, if he would allow the interruption to redirect what was happening. But when she glanced back at him, she saw no sign of that, only that same steady focus, that same quiet intensity that seemed to exist entirely outside the expectations of the room. And when he finally responded, his voice was calm, measured, but carrying a weight that silenced any further attempt at interruption. "Then we will resolve it," he said, and the words settled over the court with finality, leaving no room for argument. And Elena felt something shift again, not in the room, but within herself. The warmth in her chest reacting to his voice in a way she could not ignore, deepening slightly, as if acknowledging the decision, and it made her breath catch, because it felt intentional, purposeful, not random or uncontrolled, and the realization sent a ripple of unease through her thoughts, because if this was not the bond they expected, then what was it? And before she could follow the thought further, Lucien moved again, closing the remaining distance between them until only a few feet separated them, close enough that she could see the faint reflection of herself in his eyes, small but clear, and the proximity made the warmth surge slightly, not overwhelming, but enough to make her aware of every inch of space between them. And for a moment, she wondered if he could feel it too, if whatever this was existed on both sides, and the question lingered, unanswered, as he spoke, quieter now, but no less commanding. "You are not reacting as expected," he said, and there was no accusation in his tone, only observation. And Elena felt a strange sense of grounding in that, because he was not trying to force her into a role she could not fulfill. He was acknowledging that something had changed, and that acknowledgement mattered more than she wanted to admit, and she found herself answering before she could stop herself. "Neither are you." And the words slipped out, soft but clear, and for a fraction of a second, the court seemed to freeze again, as if the very idea of speaking to him that way was as shocking as everything else that had happened. But Lucien did not react with anger, did not correct her. Instead, there was the faintest shift in his expression, something almost like approval, though it was too subtle to name, and it sent another unexpected ripple through her chest, something that felt dangerously close to understanding, and the realization unsettled her, because it meant that this moment was no longer just about defiance. It was about something else, something deeper, something neither of them had anticipated. And she saw the court react to it as well, the unease growing sharper, more pronounced, as if the distance between expectation and reality was widening too quickly to ignore. And then, from somewhere behind the nobles, a different kind of voice rose, not sharp or commanding, but low, steady, carrying a weight that came not from authority but from knowledge. "It is not a failure." The words were quiet, but they cut through the tension with surprising clarity. And Elena turned slightly, just enough to catch sight of the speaker, an older woman standing at the edge of the court, her posture calm, her gaze focused not on the king, but on Elena herself. And there was something in her eyes, something knowing, something that made Elena's breath catch before she understood why. "It is a divergence," the woman continued, her voice steady, unhurried, as if she were speaking a truth that had simply been waiting to be recognized. And the words settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward, and Elena felt it resonate within her, felt it align with the warmth in her chest in a way that made everything else seem distant, less certain, and for the first time since she had entered the hall, she felt something close to understanding, not complete, not fully formed, but enough to know that what was happening was not a mistake, not a flaw, but something intentional, something that had its own place, even if that place had never existed before. And when she looked back at Lucien, she saw that he had heard it too, that the word had reached him in the same way it had reached her, because his gaze shifted, not away, but deeper, as if he were seeing something new, something that had not been visible before. And in that moment, with the court suspended between confusion and realization, Elena understood that this was no longer about proving she belonged. It was about redefining what belonging meant, and the thought settled into her with a quiet certainty that steadied her even as the world around her continued to shift, because whatever came next, whatever this divergence truly was, she was no longer standing in it as something lesser. She was standing in it as something unknown, and that was a kind of power no one in this room yet understood. The word lingered in the air long after it was spoken, divergence, and Elena felt it settle into her bones as if it had always belonged there, as if it had been waiting for someone to finally name it. And the warmth in her chest responded in quiet agreement, steady and certain, no longer something unfamiliar, but something that felt almost right. And that realization grounded her in a way nothing else had, even as the court around her struggled to understand what they were witnessing. Because the tension had not faded, it had transformed, sharpened into something more focused, more dangerous in its uncertainty. And she could feel it in the way the nobles shifted, in the way their eyes moved between her and the Alpha King, searching for a reaction that would restore balance, searching for a sign that this moment could still be contained. But there was none, because Lucien Blackthorne did not dismiss the word, did not correct the woman who had spoken it. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, his gaze fixed on Elena with that same steady intensity. And for the first time, she realized that he was not trying to force an outcome. He was observing, measuring, as if this moment mattered to him in a way that went beyond expectation. And the thought sent a subtle tension through her chest, because it meant that whatever this was, it was not just affecting her, it was affecting him as well. And that made it real in a way she could not ignore. And the silence stretched again, heavier now with meaning, until it was broken by a new shift in the room, not a voice this time, but movement. The older woman stepping forward from the edge of the court, her presence calm but undeniable as she crossed the polished stone floor with measured steps, each one deliberate, each one drawing the attention of those around her without effort. And Elena watched her approach with a growing sense of awareness, because there was something different about her, something that did not rely on power or status, but on knowledge, on certainty. And when she finally stopped a few feet away, her gaze settled on Elena with a quiet focus that felt almost like recognition. "You feel it clearly now," she said, her voice soft but carrying through the hall, without strain. And Elena hesitated for only a moment before nodding, because there was no point denying it, no point pretending that this was anything less than what it was. And the woman inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging the answer. "Then you understand the first truth," she continued, and the words drew a subtle ripple of unease through the court, because they were not part of any known ritual, any known structure. And Elena felt that unease as well, but it did not shake her, not the way it would have before, because the warmth in her chest remained steady, anchoring her in a way she had never experienced. And she found herself asking the question that had been building since the moment everything changed. "What truth?" she said, her voice quiet but clear. And the woman's expression softened slightly, not with pity, but with something closer to approval. "That what you are experiencing is not absence," she said, her gaze steady. "It is distinction." And the word settled over Elena with a weight that felt different from everything else that had been said, because it did not diminish what she was, it defined it. And the realization sent a subtle shift through her thoughts, a quiet reordering of everything she had believed about herself. And she felt it in the way her shoulders straightened, in the way her breath steadied, in the way the warmth in her chest seemed to settle deeper, more secure, as if it had found its place. And across from her, Lucien's gaze did not waver, but there was a change there, a subtle shift in the way he held himself, as if the pieces of something were beginning to align. And for a moment, Elena wondered if he understood it as well, if the word had reached him in the same way it had reached her. And the thought lingered as the woman continued, The bond you expected does not form because you are not meant to follow it, she said, and the murmurs that followed were immediate, sharp, the court reacting to the idea with confusion, with disbelief, because it challenged something fundamental, something they had never questioned, and Elena felt that reaction press against her, felt the weight of it, but it no longer held the same power over her, because she could feel the truth of the words within herself, could feel the way they aligned with the warmth that had not faded, that had not faltered, and for the first time, she allowed herself to consider what that might mean, not in terms of what she lacked, but in terms of what she was, and the thought was both unfamiliar and strangely empowering, and she saw the effect it had on the room, the way the nobles shifted again, their certainty eroding further as the foundation of their understanding began to crack. And then Lucien spoke, his voice cutting through the murmurs with quiet authority. "Explain," he said, and the single word carried enough weight to silence the room once more, and the woman inclined her head slightly before answering. "There are rare instances," she said, "when the order does not repeat itself as expected, when something new emerges from what was once considered fixed." And Elena felt her breath catch slightly, because the words resonated in a way that felt almost personal, as if they were not just describing a concept, but her. And the woman's gaze shifted between Elena and Lucien as she continued. "In such cases, the absence of the bond is not a failure, but an indication that the connection operates on a different principle." And the explanation settled into the room slowly, met with uncertainty, with hesitation, because it offered no immediate resolution, no clear path forward. And Elena understood why, because it meant that the rules they had always relied on no longer applied. And that was something the court was not prepared to accept, but she could feel it, could feel the truth of it within herself, and that was enough. And then, without warning, the warmth in her chest shifted again, not stronger, not brighter, but more focused, like a pulse that had found direction, and she inhaled sharply, the sensation catching her off guard, and she saw it reflected in Lucien's expression, the way his gaze sharpened further, the way his attention seemed to lock onto her completely. And for a moment, everything else faded, the court, the voices, the tension, until there was only that shared awareness, that quiet, undeniable connection that did not demand, did not pull, but simply existed. And Elena realized with a clarity that settled deep within her that whatever this was, it was not something to fear, it was something to understand. And as the silence returned once more, heavier now with realization, she knew that the moment had already gone beyond defiance, beyond expectation, into something entirely new, and there was no turning back from that. The awareness did not fade. It sharpened, settling into Elena's senses with a clarity that made everything else feel distant, like the court, the whispers. Even the towering walls themselves had lost their weight, and all that remained was the quiet, steady pulse within her chest and the presence standing before her. And she realized with a subtle shift of breath that she was no longer reacting to the room. She was anchoring it, because the tension that had once pressed against her now seemed to revolve around her instead. And that change, though subtle, was undeniable, and she saw it reflected in the way the nobles held themselves, no longer leaning inward with expectation, but holding back with uncertainty, as if unsure how close they could come to something they did not understand. And the realization did not make her feel powerful in the way they might define it. It made her feel certain, in a way she had never been before, and that certainty steadied her even as the silence stretched once more, until Lucien Blackthorne moved again, not with command, not with force, but with intention, his gaze never leaving hers as he took another step closer, reducing the space between them to something that felt almost symbolic. And Elena felt the warmth respond instantly. Not surging, not overwhelming, but aligning, like two currents recognizing each other without merging, and the sensation made her inhale slowly, deliberately, because she understood now that this was not something to resist, it was something to observe, to understand. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but carried a depth that seemed to reach beyond the surface of the moment. "It is not submission," he said, as if answering a question that had not been asked aloud. And Elena felt the truth of that settle within her immediately, because she had already felt it, already recognized that this connection did not demand anything from her, did not pull her into a role she could not fulfill, and she found herself responding without hesitation. "No," she said, her voice steady, grounded in a way that felt new, and the words seemed to solidify something between them, something unspoken but understood, and for a moment, neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing more to say that would make it clearer than it already was, and the court felt it too. The shift from confusion to something more uncertain, more fragile, because this was no longer a situation that could be corrected. It was something that had to be accepted or challenged, and Elena could sense that divide forming, could feel it in the way some of the nobles remained still, watching with cautious attention, while others shifted with discomfort, their expressions tightening as if they were witnessing something that threatened more than just a single moment. And then, from the far side of the hall, a voice rose again, sharper this time, carrying a controlled edge that cut through the quiet. "This cannot be allowed to redefine the order." The words were measured, deliberate, but beneath them was something less controlled, something closer to fear, and Elena turned slightly, just enough to see the speaker, a man of high standing, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed not on her, but on the Alpha King, as if appealing to the authority he believed would restore balance. "The structure exists for a reason," he continued. "If exceptions are permitted, then the entire system becomes unstable." And the words sent a ripple through the court, because they gave voice to what many were thinking, what many feared, and Elena felt that fear brush against her, not as something that belonged to her, but as something external, something she could now recognize without absorbing. And that distinction mattered more than she expected, because it meant she was no longer defined by the reactions of those around her. And as she turned her gaze back to Lucien, she saw that he had heard it as well, that the challenge had reached him, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for his response, waiting to see whether he would reinforce the structure or allow it to bend. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, but there was a finality to it that left no room for interpretation. "The structure exists to serve the truth," he said, and the words settled into the hall with quiet authority, silencing any further argument before it could form, and Elena felt something shift within her again, not the warmth, but something deeper, something that felt like recognition, because in that moment, he had not chosen control, he had chosen understanding, and that choice mattered in a way she could not fully explain, and the court reacted to it immediately, the tension sharpening into something more divided, more uncertain, because the foundation they had relied on was no longer solid. And Elena could feel that instability ripple outward, could feel the way the balance of the room had changed, and yet, within that instability, she remained steady, anchored by the quiet certainty that had taken root inside her, and she realized that this was what the woman had meant, this distinction, this divergence. It was not just about what she was, it was about what she represented, a shift in something larger than herself, and the thought should have been overwhelming, but it was not, it was grounding, because it gave meaning to what she felt, to what she had experienced, and as the silence returned once more, heavier now with implication, Elena understood that this moment was no longer about proving anything. It was about revealing something that had always existed beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to be seen. And as she met Lucien's gaze again, unflinching, unwavering, she knew that whatever came next would not be dictated by the expectations of the court, but by the truth they had just uncovered. And that truth was something no one in this room could ignore any longer. The truth did not settle quietly. It spread, threading through the hall in ways Elena could not see but could feel, like a shift beneath the surface of something long held in place. And she stood at the center of it, not as the cause, but as the point where everything now converged. And the realization was both grounding and unsettling, because it meant that what had begun as a single act of defiance had become something far larger, something that could not be undone simply by restoring order. And she could feel that understanding ripple outward through the court, in the way conversations no longer tried to form, in the way even the most composed figures now held themselves with a subtle tension, as if waiting for the next moment to define whether this change would hold or collapse. And Elena's breath remained steady, her posture unchanged, because the warmth within her had not wavered, it had not faltered, it had simply continued, constant and deliberate, like a quiet rhythm that no longer needed her attention to exist, and that steadiness gave her something she had never known before, not confidence, not pride, but clarity, a sense that whatever came next, she would not be pulled apart by it. And across from her, Lucian Blackthorn remained equally still, his presence no longer pressing against her, but aligning with the space between them, as if he too had recognized that force would not shape this moment. And that realization alone was enough to shift something fundamental in the room, because power that chose not to dominate was something the court did not know how to respond to. And the silence stretched, heavy and expectant, until it was broken not by command, but by a quieter movement. The older woman stepping slightly to the side, her gaze still fixed on Elena, but now inclusive of the space around them, as if acknowledging that what was happening could no longer be contained between two individuals. "You feel the difference," she said, her voice calm, certain, and Elena nodded before she could stop herself, because the difference was undeniable. It was in the way the warmth did not demand, did not pull. It simply existed, and the woman inclined her head slightly, as if that confirmation was all she needed. "Then you must understand the second truth," she continued, and the words drew a subtle shift through the court, sharper this time, because the idea of truths beyond what they knew was something that unsettled more than it reassured. And Elena felt that reaction, felt the tension tighten, but it did not reach her the way it once would have, because she was no longer standing within their expectations, she was standing outside them, and that distance gave her a clarity that felt almost like calm. "This connection does not bind," the woman said, her gaze steady. "It reveals," and the words settled into Elena's chest with a weight that felt heavier than the last, because it did not just describe what she was experiencing. It implied something deeper, something that had yet to fully surface, and for a moment, Elena's thoughts shifted inward, searching for what that might mean, searching for what exactly was being revealed, and she felt it there, beneath the warmth, beneath the steadiness, something quieter, something that had been hidden not by others, but by herself, and the realization was subtle, not overwhelming, but enough to make her inhale slowly, as if preparing for something she could not yet see. And across from her, Lucian's gaze sharpened slightly, as if he had noticed the shift, as if he too understood that this moment was not complete, that something more was unfolding, and the awareness passed between them without words, a quiet acknowledgement that neither of them needed to voice. And the court felt it as well, the tension rising not from confusion now, but from anticipation, from the sense that something was building toward a point they could not predict. And then, from the far edge of the hall, another voice broke through, lower, more cautious. "If it reveals," the speaker said slowly, "then what is it revealing?" And the question hung in the air, not as a challenge, but as a need for understanding that the court could no longer ignore. And Elena felt it settle within her as well, because she did not have the answer, not fully, but she could feel the direction of it, could sense that whatever this was, it was not just about her. It was about something that connected beyond her, something that extended into the space between her and Lucian. And that realization drew her gaze back to him, steady, unflinching, because if this connection revealed something, then it revealed it in both of them. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the answer was not something that could be given in words, it was something that had to be seen. And then, without warning, the warmth within her shifted again, not stronger, not brighter, but clearer, like a signal finally coming into focus. And Elena felt her breath catch as the sensation moved through her chest, through her thoughts, settling into something she could finally begin to understand, not as a force, not as a bond, but as recognition, not of him, but of herself. And the realization was quiet, but it carried a weight that changed everything, because it meant that what she had always been told she lacked had never been absence. It had been difference, and that difference was not a weakness. It was something else entirely, something that had been waiting for this moment to emerge, and she saw it reflected in Lucian's expression, the way his gaze held hers with a depth that was no longer searching, but acknowledging, as if he too had reached the same understanding. And for the first time since this moment began, Elena felt something shift between them that was not tension, not uncertainty, but something steadier, something that did not need definition to exist, and the court felt it as well. The shift from anticipation to realization, from confusion to something more complex, because what had been revealed was not something they could dismiss. It was something they would have to confront, and as the silence settled once more, deeper now, heavier with meaning, Elena understood that the moment had reached a point of no return, that whatever came next would not be a correction, but a continuation, and that continuation would reshape everything they believed about the world they stood in. And for the first time, she did not feel like she was standing against that change. She felt like she was standing at the center of it. The realization did not end the moment. It deepened it, settling into the space between Elena and the Alpha King like something that had always existed but had only just been seen, and she could feel the shift it created, not just within herself, but throughout the hall, because the air itself seemed to change, the tension no longer sharp or uncertain, but heavy with something quieter, something more deliberate. And for a moment, no one spoke, no one moved, as if the entire court had reached the edge of something they did not yet understand and were afraid to step beyond it. And Elena stood at the center of that stillness, aware of the warmth within her, aware of the way it no longer felt unfamiliar or intrusive, but natural, as if it belonged to her in a way nothing else ever had. And that thought alone changed the way she held herself, not in posture, but in presence, because she was no longer bracing against the room. She was standing within it, steady and unshaken, and across from her, Lucian Blackthorne did not look away, his gaze steady, grounded, no longer searching for answers, but acknowledging what had already been revealed, and that acknowledgement created something between them that did not need explanation, something that existed beyond the expectations of the court, and it unsettled the room in a way that could no longer be ignored, because power that did not dominate, connection that did not bind, these were not things the structure had prepared them for. And Elena could feel that tension building again, not from confusion now, but from resistance, from the need to restore what had been disrupted, and it came in the form of movement, subtle at first, then more deliberate. As several high-ranking nobles shifted forward, their expressions controlled but firm, as if drawing a line that had not been there before, and one of them spoke, his voice measured but carrying an edge that cut through the quiet. "If this is not a bond," he said, "then it cannot be recognized." And the words settled into the hall with weight, not as truth, but as an attempt to define it, to contain it. And Elena felt the implication immediately, felt the way the statement tried to reduce what had happened into something dismissible, something that could be set aside without consequence. And for a moment, she felt the old instinct rise, the urge to shrink, to step back into invisibility, because that had always been the safer choice. But the warmth in her chest did not falter, did not allow that instinct to take hold. It remained steady, anchoring her in a way that made retreat feel impossible. And she realized with quiet certainty that she would not step back. Not now. Not after everything that had already been revealed. And the thought settled into her with a calm that surprised her, because it was not defiance this time. It was clarity, and that difference mattered. And she saw it reflected in Lucian's response, or rather, in the absence of one, because he did not immediately counter the noble's words, did not dismiss them or reinforce them. He simply remained still, his gaze shifting briefly toward the speaker before returning to Elena, as if the answer he sought did not lie in the court, but in her, and the realization sent a subtle ripple through her chest, because it meant that this moment, this decision, was not his alone, it was shared, and that shared weight changed everything. And the court felt it too, the shift in authority, the way the center of the moment no longer rested solely with the Alpha King, but extended to the Omega who stood before him, and that realization unsettled them more than anything else had, because it challenged not just a rule, but the very structure they relied on, and Elena could see it in their eyes, in the way they watched her now, not with dismissal, but with something sharper, something more cautious, and for a moment, the silence returned, heavy and expectant, until the older woman spoke again. Her voice calm, but carrying a quiet authority that cut through the tension without force. "Recognition does not create truth," she said, her gaze steady as it moved across the court. "It follows it." And the words settled into the room with a clarity that was difficult to ignore, because they did not argue, they did not challenge, they simply stated, and Elena felt them resonate within her, felt the way they aligned with everything she had experienced, everything she now understood, and for the first time, she realized that she did not need the court to define what had happened. She did not need their acceptance to validate it, because it already existed, independent of their acknowledgement, and that realization freed something within her, something subtle but undeniable, and she felt it in the way her breath steadied, in the way her shoulders relaxed, in the way the warmth in her chest seemed to settle deeper, more secure, as if it had found its place not just within her, but within the moment itself. And when she looked back at Lucien, she saw that he had reached the same understanding, that the question was no longer whether this connection could be recognized, but whether it would be allowed to exist, and that distinction mattered, because it shifted the focus from validation to choice, and the weight of that choice hung in the air, pressing against the silence that followed. And Elena realized that this was the turning point, not the moment of revelation, but the moment of decision, and she felt it settle within her, not as pressure, but as certainty, because she already knew her answer, even before the question was spoken, and as the court waited, as the tension held steady, she understood that whatever came next would not be dictated by fear, or by expectation, or by the structure that had defined her for so long. It would be dictated by the truth she had already chosen to stand in, and that truth was no longer something she needed to defend, it was something she simply was. And that realization made her still, completely still, as she met Lucien's gaze once more, unflinching, unwavering, ready for whatever would come next, because for the first time in her life, she was not waiting to be chosen. She was standing as someone who had already chosen herself. The choice did not need to be spoken for Elena to feel it settle into place. It moved through her like a quiet certainty, steady and unshaken. And as she stood there beneath the towering ceiling of the court, she realized that for the first time, the silence around her was no longer something she feared. It was something she controlled, not through power or authority, but through presence. Through the simple fact that she no longer needed to bend to fill the expectations pressing in from every side, and that realization changed the way the moment held together, because the tension that had once been directed at her now seemed to circle her instead, unable to find a point of weakness to anchor itself. And the court felt it. She could see it in the subtle hesitation in there. Surprised even her. Then it is not the law that defines this, she said. And the words seemed to echo slightly, not because they were loud, but because they were unexpected, because they came from a place the court had never considered. And for a heartbeat, the room stilled again, caught between reaction and realization. And Elena felt the weight of that stillness. But it did not shake her, it anchored her, because she knew what she was saying, even if she could not yet explain all of it. It exists whether you recognize it or not. She continued, her gaze steady, her focus unwavering, and the truth of the words settled into the space around her, not as a challenge, but as a statement that could not be undone, and the court reacted to it immediately, the tension sharpening, the uncertainty deepening, because this was no longer just a disruption, it was a refusal to be contained. And that refusal forced them into a position they had never faced before, where the authority they relied on could not simply override what was unfolding. And Elena could see it in their expressions, in the way some of them looked to Lucien, waiting for him to reassert control, to restore the structure they depended on, and the silence that followed was heavy with that expectation. But Lucien did not move, did not speak, not immediately. And Elena realized with a subtle shift of breath that he was not hesitating. He was allowing the moment to fully reveal itself, and that choice carried a weight that the court could not ignore, because it meant that this was no longer just his decision. It was something shared, something that could not be resolved by authority alone. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was a depth to it that settled into the room with quiet certainty. "Then we do not define it yet," he said. And the words carried more weight than any command, because they acknowledged the truth without attempting to contain it, and the effect was immediate. The court falling into a deeper silence, one that was no longer filled with expectation, but with realization, because the structure they had relied on was no longer absolute. And Elena felt that shift settle into the room like a change in gravity, subtle but undeniable, and within that shift, she felt something else as well, something quieter, something more personal, the warmth within her responding not just to the moment, but to the acknowledgement itself, as if it had been waiting for that recognition to fully settle, and the sensation drew her attention inward for just a moment, enough to notice that it was no longer just a presence. It was a pattern, something that moved with intention, something that seemed to align with her thoughts, her decisions, and the realization sent a quiet ripple through her, because it meant that whatever this was, it was not separate from her. It was a part of her, something that had always been there, waiting for the moment it could no longer be ignored. And as she lifted her gaze again, meeting Lucien's eyes once more, she saw that he understood it as well, not fully, not completely, but enough to recognize that this was not something external, not something imposed, but something intrinsic, and that understanding created a shift between them that was subtle but undeniable, because it removed the need for control, for dominance, leaving only awareness, and the court felt it, the absence of the expected dynamic, the presence of something they could not define, and in that absence, in that uncertainty, Elena realized that the moment had reached its breaking point, not in chaos, but in transformation, because the question was no longer whether this could exist, but how the world around it would respond. And as the silence settled once more, deeper and more complex than before, she understood that whatever came next would not just shape her path, it would reshape the structure itself. And that realization did not frighten her, it steadied her, because for the first time, she was not standing beneath that structure. She was standing at the edge of something new, something that had not yet been written, and she was no longer waiting for permission to step into it. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, dense with the weight of something irreversible, as if the moment itself had crossed a threshold that no one in the room could step back from. And Elena stood at its center, aware not only of the court around her, but of the quiet alignment within her, the steady presence that no longer felt like a question, but like an answer she had always carried. And as she breathed, slow and controlled, she could feel it responding, not to fear, not to pressure, but to her awareness, as if it recognized that she had finally seen it for what it was, and that recognition changed everything, because it meant she was no longer reacting to what was happening. She was part of it, shaping it simply by standing where she stood, and across from her, Lucien Blackthorne remained equally still, his gaze unwavering, but there was something different in it now, something that had shifted from observation to decision, and Elena felt that shift before he spoke, felt it in the subtle change in the air, in the way the tension seemed to gather and hold, as if waiting for his next words to define what came after. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried through the hall with a quiet authority that did not demand attention but commanded it all the same. "This is not an error," he said, and the words settled into the room, like a foundation being laid beneath something new. And Elena felt them resonate within her, not as confirmation, but as alignment, because she had already known it, already felt it, and hearing it spoken did not change that truth. It simply made it visible to everyone else. And the court reacted immediately, the tension shifting again, sharper this time, more divided, because what he had said did not restore order. It disrupted it further, and Elena could see it in the way the nobles exchanged glances, in the way their certainty fractured into something more uncertain, more fragile, and yet no one spoke immediately, because the weight of his words held them in place. And in that pause, Elena became aware of something else, something she had not fully noticed before. The way the warmth within her was no longer just steady, but responsive, not reacting to the room, but to him, to the shift in his presence. And the realization made her breath catch slightly, because it meant that whatever this connection was, it was not one-sided. It existed in the space between them, shaped by both of them. And that understanding carried a weight that settled deep within her, because it meant that this was not something she had to face alone. And as that thought took hold, she felt the warmth shift again, not stronger, not brighter, but clearer, like a pattern that had finally come into focus. And she understood then, not in words, but in instinct, that this was not about binding or claiming. It was about recognition, about seeing something that had always been there, but had never been acknowledged. And that realization steadied her even as the court began to react once more. Voices rising in controlled but urgent tones. "If it is not an error, then what is it?" One of the nobles demanded, his voice tight with the need for clarity. What place does it hold within the structure? Another added. And Elena could feel the pressure of those questions, not directed at her, but at the moment itself, at the space that had opened and refused to close. And she realized that they were not just asking for answers. They were asking for limits, for boundaries that could contain what was happening. And for the first time, she understood that those limits might not exist. And the thought was both unsettling and strangely freeing, because it meant that this was not something that could be reduced or controlled. It was something that would have to be understood on its own terms. And she saw that understanding begin to take shape in Lucien's expression, the way his gaze shifted slightly, not away from her, but outward, as if considering the implications of what he had just acknowledged. And when he spoke again, his voice was just as calm, but there was a depth to it now that carried beyond the immediate moment. It holds the place it creates, he said, and the words settled into the room with a quiet certainty that left no room for contradiction, because they did not define, they allowed, and that allowance was something the court did not know how to respond to. And Elena felt that uncertainty ripple outward, felt the way it unsettled the structure that had always relied on clear definitions, clear boundaries, and in that ripple, she felt something else. As well, something quieter, something that seemed to originate not from the room, but from within her, the warmth shifting once more, not outward this time, but inward, as if drawing her attention deeper, and she followed it without thinking, her awareness narrowing to the space within her chest, to the steady pulse that had guided her through this entire moment. And as she focused on it, she realized that it was not just a presence, it was a connection, not to him, not to the court, but to something deeper, something that felt older, more fundamental. And the realization made her inhale sharply, because it meant that this was not just about what was happening now. It was about something that had been waiting long before this moment. And as she lifted her gaze again, meeting Lucien's eyes once more, she saw that he felt it too, not in the same way, not exactly, but enough to recognize that what they were standing in was larger than either of them. And that recognition created a shift between them that was subtle but undeniable, because it removed the last trace of expectation, leaving only awareness. And in that awareness, Elena understood that the moment had changed again, not in the court, not in the structure, but in something deeper, something that would not be undone by words or decisions. And as the silence settled once more, heavier now with the weight of what had been revealed, she knew that this was the turning point, not because of what had been said, but because of what had been understood, and that understanding would shape everything that came after. Whether the court accepted it or not, the understanding did not remain contained within thought. It moved, it shifted, it settled into something that could be felt in the air itself, and Elena realized with a slow, steady breath that this was no longer just a moment of realization. It was a moment of recognition, not only for her, not only for Lucien, but for everyone who stood within the reach of what had just been revealed. And the court felt it. She could see it in the way their stillness had changed, no longer rigid, no longer waiting for a command to restore order, but uncertain in a different way, as if something deeper had unsettled them, something they could not dismiss with logic or tradition. And she understood why, because this was not a disruption that could be corrected. It was a truth that had already taken root, and truths, once seen, could not be unseen, and the weight of that realization settled over the hall like a quiet pressure, not forceful, not overwhelming, but